G'day friends, it's Andrew here again from Nature's Image Photography, and if you're a regular visitor to my channel, you might have seen my recent video featuring a photo outing at the Mount Coot Botanic Gardens. Well, in this video I'm going to show you how I edit two of those photos in real time using Adobe Camera Raw, from the RAW file right through to the finished JPEG. Before we start, if this is your first visit, be sure to subscribe while you're here, and if you want to thank me for my efforts by buying me a coffee, you'll find the link in the information below. The first shot I'll be working on is this one, and I think you'll agree it's hard to go past colours like this. For those who need them, here's the essential camera info. It was taken on the Panasonic Lumix G9 with the Leica Panasonic 12-60mm lens, zoomed all the way out to the 60mm. ISO was 200, aperture was closed down a little to f6.3, and the shutter speed was 100th of a second. Normally a shot like this would be hard to pull off handheld, but I managed it thanks to the amazing image stabilizer on the G9. Now let's go to Adobe Bridge and let the fun begin. So the adventure begins here in Adobe Bridge. This is the cataloging software connected to Photoshop, and this is where I organize and select my files. While I have a quick run through some of what you see here, I want to address a question that came up recently. People who watch my videos regularly will know I recently made a video about my visit to the Botanic Gardens, and in the comments somebody asked me what's my success rate, and I don't really know how to answer that, because you can see as I run through these, I take a lot of photographs and there's not a lot of great rejects among them, but at the same time there's a lot that are very similar, if not exactly the same. So the trick then is to go through a bunch of photos that are pretty good and find that one or two that stand out above the others. So it's not so much about having a big reject rate, but I've still got to go through and pick the one I'm going to use. This is the first photo I'm going to edit today, and I chose it simply because it's just a fraction sharper than the photos either side of it, and also because I like the position of the bug. So this is the one I've selected. I know I haven't really answered the question about success rate properly, but that's the best answer I've got. So I double click on this, and that sends the photograph across into Adobe Camera Raw, and this is where all the editing happens. Now if you've watched one of these videos before, you know that I usually start with a crop, so that's what I'm going to do, simply because I want to work on the cropped photograph rather than editing the photograph and then cropping out details of it later on. So I think this one could just use a bit of a tighter crop, and I'm already thinking that the native aspect ratio of the Lumix G9 isn't quite what I want for this picture. It's hard to explain, it's just a judgment call, but I'm going to come across here to the aspect ratio, and often I'll do 16:9 for my YouTube videos, but I think that's a bit long and narrow for this picture. It's cutting out a bit too much of the photograph, so I'm going to go with an old-fashioned 2:3 crop, and then it's just a matter of adjusting the dimensions until I'm happy with what I'm looking at. I wanted to get rid of some of that extra space over on the right here, which I think we can do without, and also have my bug not too far from that intersecting point according to the rule of thirds. So I think that's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll see if I can just get a little bit more flower in there, and there's no definite right or wrong to this. It's purely a matter of what feels good to me, and I'm going to go with that. So now if I click enter on my keyboard, that locks the crop in place, and my cursor currently is a magnifying glass, so if I click on that it'll go to full screen, and this is now the picture I'll be working on. Now you can see the picture is very colourful and vibrant just as it is. So I think you can tell from the start this picture is not going to need a whole lot of editing. It's going to be a fairly simple process. Often I'll start with clicking auto just to see what the computer comes up with, and I kind of like that, I've got to say, but I'd rather do this myself, so I'm going to unclick auto and work on this myself. I'll usually start with exposure and just bring it to the right a little bit. In this case I just want to make this so the overall photograph looks about as bright as I'd like it to be. I'm not looking at every detail at this stage because I can still work on that, but just make sure the overall picture is about as bright as it should be. From there I'm going to come down to whites, and if I put my finger on the Alt button on my keyboard and then click across, click on whites, If I slide that across, it just begins to show us there where the widest parts of the photograph are, and that's as far as I want to take that. I do the same with blacks. I put my finger on the Alt button, click down on blacks, and you can see there's already just a fraction of the blacks there, and that is telling the computer that these, or telling Photoshop, these are the brightest and darkest parts of my photograph that I want to set the limits, and all the other pixels should fall somewhere in between. So all we've done so far is a little bit of adjustment of the brightness and the very bright highlights and the blackest blacks. Now I'll take that a little bit further. I'm going to start with shadows, because this little bug is very black, and I think because it's the darkest thing in the shot, if I slide shadows across to the right, it just starts to show me a little bit more detail of the eye and the body of the bug. There's not quite so much black in there now. I'll come to highlights too, and I think already this photograph is looking pretty lively. As I said, it wasn't going to need a whole lot of work to start with. Now if I come down here and toggle this little switch, you can see where we started and where we are now. And this photograph really isn't going to take a whole lot more than that. Often at this point I will have a look at white balance, and my instinct usually with the Lumix G9 is to grab the tint slider and slide it a little bit across to the left, because it tends to skew a little bit towards magenta. But given the colour of this flower, which is essentially a magenta colour anyway, I don't think it really needs any messing. I'm pretty happy with the white balance of this photograph just as it was shot, so I'm not going to touch that. I'll come down here to clarity, and I'll have a look at contrast and clarity. Let's do contrast first. I just find with contrast and clarity, it'll take a photograph and just add that little extra sense of three-dimensional quality to it. So the picture looks more like you're looking through the window at the real thing rather than a flatter image. But having added to that contrast, I think it's making the darker areas look a little bit dark. So remember, with these sliders you can always revisit them. So I am going to grab the shadows now, bring them across to the right a little bit more, and I'm going to have a look at highlights just to see if it needs to come down a little bit more. But no, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference unless I go all the way, and I'm pretty happy with the highlights where they were. So I'm going to leave those. It's a very vibrant photograph as it is, but I'm going to now just have a look at vibrance, bring it across to the right just a tiny bit. Don't want to overdo it, because in this photograph you could really go too far very easily. So vibrance I brought up just the tiniest fraction. Now I'm going to close down basic, because I'm pretty happy with where we are there. And I'm going to work my way down through here. I don't worry with curve, but I'm going to have a look at detail. Now when I look at detail, I really want to see the photograph at 100%. You can really tell if you adjust the sharpness when you're looking at the photograph at this level. Now the photograph was taken at 200 ISO, so it's not a noisy image. I don't need to worry about the noise, but I will bring sharpening across just a little bit. Usually I stop at about somewhere between 50 and 55, and that'll just bring that extra little bit of clarity into the outlines of the insect, which is the most sharp-edged part of the photograph. And that's all I really need to do there. Close that down. Color mixer, there's nothing I really need to do too much. I could just have a look at the yellows here and the luminance. Obviously there's a fair bit of yellow in this shot, and just see if bringing luminance across does anything to the picture. And I think no, because that way it looks too dull, this way it looks overdone. I think we were pretty happy with where it was. I'm not going to mess with color mixer any further. I'm just going to shut that down. Now this photograph, of all the ones I've processed, is probably the one that needs the least amount of editing. So I've done basic, I've done detail. I'm just going to have a look at effects and perhaps look at a little bit of a vignette. That'll just darken around the outside edges of the photograph, and that just draws attention to what's going on in the center a tiny bit more, and I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm not going to do any more on that photograph. I wanted this to be a quick little demonstration because it is a photograph that doesn't need much work. So now if I click open, that sends my photograph across into Adobe Photoshop, and if there's any finishing off that needs to be done, I'll do it here. So now I'm going to click Auto Contrast just to see if Adobe Photoshop comes up with something a little bit better than what I did, and it's made so little difference that I think that's a bit of a sign that I haven't done a bad job with my editing. Sometimes I'll also look at levels and click Auto, again just as a bit of double checking my work to see if the computer comes up with something better, but I don't like that, it's too pale, so I much prefer the version that I had. So I'm going to undo levels, and this is the picture that I'm going to end up working with. So that's one photograph done. Okay, so one down, one to go. Here's the second photo I've chosen, and once again I'll start with the camera and exposure details. It's taken on the G9, this time with the Leica Panasonic 100-400mm lens, zoomed out to 300mm. ISO was 400, aperture was f5.7, and this was also handheld at just 125th of a second, which again says a thing or two about that image stabilizer. So back to Adobe Bridge again, and now looking at the second photograph I'm going to work on. This is the one I've selected, and you can see once again it is selected out of a bunch of photographs that are all quite similar. There's a few that I could have used, but I've decided to choose this one as the one I'll work with. One of the differences, or two differences in the way this was taken, it was very late in the afternoon, which means a little bit of a shift of the colour towards more of a bluey sort of look, I suppose, as we get into the late afternoon in the shade. And it was taken at 400 ISO, which means there'll be just a fraction more noise. So I'll have to do a couple of things a bit differently with this shot. First things first, of course, I just double click, and that will send my photograph into Adobe Camera Raw, and this is where the editing is going to happen. And once again I'm going to start with a crop. I think this time I'll crop it as a 16:9. So I come across to here and select 16:9 as the aspect ratio, and that's just to crop it in the same way I would if I was making this into a picture for my YouTube video. Now you've got to figure out a few things here. That flower at the back, if I try to fit all of it in, it drops this flower a little bit too low, and I think that flower is the one that's supposed to be the most eye-catching feature in the shot. So what I'm going to do is make that picture, the flower in the background, really just a background detail rather than being a major feature in the photograph. Crop up a little bit this way, bring it across, and that again puts this main flower around that intersecting point of the rule of thirds. I think that the flower on the left and right balance each other nicely, and now the flower in the background, rather than being a feature, is just a bit of background, and I think I like that. So I'm going to click enter on my keyboard, and there you can see now a pretty well balanced photograph. There are no rights or wrong to this. Once again, it's just a judgment call, and I'm pretty happy with this. This is the photograph I'll be editing. And the first thing I'll do from here, as I usually do, is just click Auto to see what Photoshop thinks. Oh, and to be honest, I'm not sure I really like that. It's added a contrast, which I like, but it's also made the photograph a little darker, which I don't like. So I'm going to unclick the Auto, and I'll take care of this myself the way I normally do. So right from the start, I'm going to grab exposure. I'm starting in this basic area of editing again, bring it across just a fraction to the right, again just trying to make the photograph look overall about as bright as I'd like it to be. It's lacking a bit of contrast. I can sort that out as I go down through the sliders. So I'm really looking now at the photograph overall, and just a little bit of extra brightness, and that's all I think it really needs. Now I'll do what I normally do, and you'll know this if you've watched one of my videos before. Put my finger down on the Alt button, come to whites, and bring the whites across to the right until they just start to appear in the picture. And the same with blacks. Go just a little bit further on the blacks to the right, so that to the left, so that we start to see a little bit more black appearing in the picture. And once again, that just tells the computer where the brightest and darkest pixels in my photograph should be, and everything else should fall in between. Now we go a little bit more into the contrast realm with a bit of adjustment of highlights and shadows. Shadows won't need too much because there's not a lot of shadow in this picture, and highlights I'm going to bring down in order to try to get a bit more detail into these very bright areas. So just bring those down a little bit, and it's all very subtle. This is a photograph that's a bit different to what I normally do, because usually you're trying to manage too much contrast. Here I'm having to bring in a little bit in to add a bit of life to the picture. Now I'm actually going to adjust the contrast slider at this point across to the right, and just try to bring that photograph to a more lifelike three-dimensional feel, and I'll do the same with clarity down here. And because I'm doing these sliders one by one and I'm doing them fairly subtly, it's probably a little bit hard to tell one step at a time how much difference it's actually making to the shot. So once again, I'll come down here and toggle to where we started and where we are now, and the differences aren't major, but they're enough to really bring the photograph to life. I'm going to adjust vibrance, and that just sort of enriches the colors a little. And speaking of colors, now I need to have a look at the white balance. As I mentioned at the start, this was taken very late afternoon, and the you can see the greens in the background are sort of leaning a little bit towards the bluish side. So here I'm going to adjust the white balance, and I can try just a couple of the preset options. There's daylight, which hasn't made much difference at all. There's shade. This photograph was taken in the shade, but I think that makes it look too yellow. So once again, I'm going to go back to as shot and just do things my own way. Now, I've mentioned several times in these videos that I think that the Lumix skews a little bit towards magenta. So I'm going to grab the the tint slider and move it across to the left a little bit. That takes it away from the magenta and a bit more towards the green. And I want to get some nice yellowy warmth in that the greens in the plant. So I'm going to grab the temperature slider and bring it across to the right, and that, I think, just looks a little bit more natural and looks like it was taken in daylight as opposed to in the shade in the late afternoon. So again, subtle differences, but enough to take a pretty good photograph and just make it look that little bit more lifelike. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now I'm wondering about a couple of things. Over here things still just look a little bit pale. I don't want to do too much in terms of highlights to the rest of the picture because I think it looks pretty good, but over here I think we could use a little bit of clarity. So now, having done most of what I think I want to do to the photograph as a whole, I'm just going to target this area, and I'm going to do that with the adjustment brush. So I come over here to the tools on the right, select adjustment brush. You see this panel appears, which is very similar to the basic editing screen, except now the adjustments I make will only happen in the area that I select. So you can see my cursor area there is quite a big circle. I want to make it a little bit smaller so that I don't overlap into other parts of the picture, and I'm going to just now select this area. Now you can't see anything happening there because I haven't made any adjustments yet, but if I click the mask up here, you'll see that area turning white, so that's letting me know which area I've selected, and it pretty much covers what I'm looking for. There's actually a little bit of overlap there, so I'm now going to come to my eraser and just make sure it doesn't overlap into the greens in the background there. Now I haven't made any adjustments, I've just selected my area. So from here I'm going to, let's see, bring the highlights down just a little bit, so that pale whiteness is starting to come back to the nice healthy bit of pink. I'm going to add some contrast and a bit of clarity, and that's all it needs. I'm just trying to take the sort of washed out look of that area at the back there and bring it to life just a little bit. Probably add a little bit more contrast, and I might even just see if I can do the same up here. Probably doesn't even need it, but there you go, that's done. So once again, I've made adjustments just to these two areas. Oh, hang on, I didn't do anything up there because I was still in eraser mode. So now I'm going to click the paintbrush again. That means I'll be adding rather than subtracting, and now I'm going to come up and do this area. unclick the mask, and now you can see what we've got. So again, the change I've made is very subtle, but it's just taking a bit of that washed out area there and bringing it to life that little bit more. Now I'm going to go back into the main editing screen, and I think I've really done pretty much all I want to do. I might just add a bit more contrast there and maybe lift out the shadows just to prevent that little bit of darkness up there from getting a bit heavy. Do I want to do that? No. I think I'll stop it about there. Once again, with these sliders, you do it to satisfy your eye. There's no right or wrong. You just slide, and if you're not happy with something, you slide back the other way. And you can always revisit the sliders after you're done. But I think I'm going to go with that because overall I'm pretty happy with the shot. It's a simple photograph of just some flowers. I'm not trying to do anything too fancy with it. I'm going to shut down basic, work my way down. I'm going to come to detail. And here now, if I come up to the 100% view, you can see the picture's just a tiny bit noisy. So I am going to bring noise reduction across just a little bit. It's the kind of level of noise you'd barely notice in a small thumbnail, but if you saw a larger version of it, it might just be a fraction noticeable. And that is the nature of the Micro Four Thirds cameras. They can be a little noisier, especially when you have a darker photo and you have to brighten it up. So from there, I'm going to adjust the sharpening as I normally do up to about 55. Take the picture back. Now, if we want to see again where we started and where we finished, that was what the photograph looked like when we began, and this is where we're up to now. So again, just a series of subtle changes, and it really brings a nice photo to life. I don't need to do anything with color mixer, any of these other options. So I'm going to come down to effects again and just see if a little bit of a vignette does anything for the photograph. I don't mind that actually, because once again it just tends to, if we double click to go back to 0, it doesn't do anything too obvious, but it just helps to draw the attention into the center of the photograph where all the color is. So that's really all I need to do to this photograph. So from there I'm going to click open, and we've got our second picture ready to go. Now once again, when I get to this point, I'll just come up here and have a look at the auto contrast and auto levels just to see if the computer can do a better job than I did on my own. And that's auto contrast. It's made just the tiniest bit of difference to the photograph. If I undo that, you'll see it was barely any difference at all. We'll come across also and have a look at auto levels. Click auto there. Makes the photograph a little bit too pale again. So I'm actually pretty happy with what I did myself. So I'm going to undo levels. I think I liked the just tiny bit of extra clarity that came with auto contrast, so I'll do that again, and that is my final photograph. All that remains now is for me to resize the photographs and save them in the folder where I want to keep them, and we're good to go. So that is the editing process pretty much from start to finish. And speaking of resizing and saving, these pictures are going to have to go into a folder ready for use in this video. So now I am going to do the final finishing off, and that is to go to image, image size. Now this one is going to be my YouTube thumbnail, and most of the photographs, or all the photos I save for YouTube, I save to 2560 pixels on the long side. So I click OK there. That automatically resizes my picture, and then I've just got to save it. So file, export, save for web, and I've already got a folder sorted for this picture to go into, so I'm just going to click save there, and then go to the other shot. As you know, I've already finished it because you watched me do it. So now I just have to click image, image size 2560, and go through the same process. File, export, save for web. Save in the same folder. And now these are the two photographs finished off, and you will see the results in the video which you're watching right now. Okay, this has been a long video, so I'll make it a short goodbye. Thanks for watching. For those who made it all the way to the end, I'm Andrew Goodall, and don't forget to subscribe to Nature's Image Photography if you haven't already.